Friend, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Again, it's an honor to be able to share some words of Torah with you this evening. I thank you for the opportunity. All of us would like to believe that we are ethical human beings. Yet it's also too easy to point the finger at another person's behavior and to second-guess their actions, or to point the finger at someone who acted incorrectly and say, "What were you thinking? They should have known better." Here is what makes this topic very complicated. All ethical decisions are made in a situation. They're situational in nature. We're not sure what we believe or how we should act until we are actually in a given situation. It's one thing to be against abortion. It's another thing to face the crisis of an unwanted pregnancy as a single, poor, unmarried woman. It's one thing to proclaim a belief in pacifism. It's another to have to deal with the need for self-defense or even revenge when you or your community has been personally attacked. It is one thing to believe in absolute objectivity, impartiality. It's another to be confronted with a decision when your conclusion might affect your career or your livelihood or your lifelong friendships. Being ethical and moral is never easy, and it's never really tested until it deals with the real situations that have actual consequences. Here is an ethical dilemma that I'd like to pose. It is from the Torah, but let me give you a little bit of setting it up. How ethical are we when no one is looking? That's difficult to imagine today because everyone has a smartphone and everyone's recording everything that we do, but let's assume that no one is watching. And here is the question that the Torah poses to us this week. It's somewhat remote from our current reality, but it's easy to apply it to our reality. Here it is. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass. You shall do the same with his garment. And so too shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. Here is a situation that you could turn your back, walk away, and no one would know the difference. The Torah is quite clear about how the obligation pans out. Our obligation is unequivocal. It is to help another. You cannot get away with indifference. Not my problem. You can't say that. The obligation is broad and inclusive. The rabbis even expand it further and say, whether the item belongs to one's enemy or one's friend, it must be returned. Nechama Leibowitz, the great 20th century commentator and teacher of Torah in Jerusalem, points out that an additional ethical dilemma is at stake here. The mitzvah, the commandment of restoring lost property, that's what this is called, involves not only the passive taking charge of the article until the owner claims it, but also an active concern with safeguarding a neighbor's possessions so that they remain intact and constitute something worth restoring. Jewish law is clear about the obligation of returning that which has been lost. The finder must, at his own expense, make a public announcement seeking the owner, literally putting an ad out saying this object has been lost. The finder must care for the property, may not profit from it, and if it is invested, owes all the earnings when it is restored. And if the finder does not make this effort, the Torah says this person is literally a thief and will be punished accordingly. What is being discussed here is not just laws of returning property, as important as they are. It's articulating a Jewish approach to life that we should not ignore. One of Judaism's central goals is the creation of trusting relationships. If we trust that our neighbor will do the right thing, our entire sense of security is raised. If we live in a state of paranoia that our neighbor couldn't care less what happens to us, life becomes hell. By returning the property, we are not only securing the economic basis of society, but we are in effect living the value of loving your neighbor as yourself. Property is an extension of ourselves. Loving one's neighbor means taking care of all that is important to them, and as you would want them to safeguard all that is important to you. This is not some insignificant passing religious value. To emphasize how important it is, the Torah clarifies the duty as a broad affirmation, an absolute necessity. The Hebrew word is lo tucha lehitalem. You must not remain unconcerned. You shall not hide. You shall not act as if you were blind. We are not permitted to look the other way, to pass without paying attention, to continue as business as usual. Sprinting away from ethical responsibility or not acting to help others is immoral. Disinterest is intolerable. Responsible caring is at the heart of Jewish ethics. Unequivocal. This is incredibly relevant in so many dimensions of our lives. Let me give you one small application. Outrage exists today about the issue of racial justice in our society. Brought to light began by the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It has become symbolic of a deep, continuing racial blemish in our society. But something remarkable happened this week. A lot of remarkable things, some quite negative, but this to me is quite positive. George Hill of the Milwaukee Bucks was one of the players who took the lead when a handful of players became tormented about this event. The players led by Hill implored their teammates not to play in their playoff game on Wednesday, believing that they had a responsibility to make a statement about how the police treat black people. What they envisioned was a one-game, on-the-fly protest. Instead, inspired one of the most broad political statements across sports leagues that the United States has ever seen. Walkouts involving hundreds of athletes in professional men's and women's basketball, baseball, soccer, as well as one of the world's biggest tennis stars. LeBron James, basketball's most famous athlete, said on Twitter that change happens with action and needs to happen now. I'm not absolutely certain at this moment, none of us are, what will be the exact results of this protest. The professional athletes will go back to work. Social change is difficult. But their statement that what happened to Jacob Blake was something that they could not turn their back on is profound. These are elite athletes, many of them black, well compensated, who live very privileged lives. They would say that themselves. They could have turned their back and say, well, that's a problem for someone else. I'm not part of that world anymore. That is not what they did. And I believe that their stand will impact the entire discussion about race in our society. What sports figures do matters. Their concern will be contagious. Nothing happens for good in our society if people turn their back, including us. The eyes of the world are on all Americans, and people are asking, how true are we to the ideals of freedom and justice for all? Let us take the lead of the Torah. If we are indifferent, we are not only neglectful, we are responsible. We have been given a roadmap by our tradition. Let us follow it towards a better world. Shabbat Shalom.